probably the greatest irony in the whole modern yoga world is the fact that Patanjali's Yoga-sutra is offered as the central text, or one of the central texts, in most yoga teacher trainings all over the world. And there could hardly be a more inappropriate text to center in the context of modern yoga. Why is that? Well, Patanjali's text is absolutely intended for people who want to transcend the body. It's not intended for those who want to cultivate the body. So Patanjali's text is written for meditators who are renunciates, who have decided, to renounce what we call ordinary human life, renounce possessions and career and sex and marriage and kids, family, living in the world, all of that, and basically meditate almost full-time and attain transcendental states through which they can disentangle their consciousness from the world as we know it entirely. So that is the original intent of Patanjali's text. This is absolutely clear. There's no doubt about it. He tells us so himself, and all scholars, everyone who can read Sanskrit really agrees that this is the intent of Patanjali's text. But of course, this intent is not clear when you read most modern translations, because modern translations are written primarily for people practicing modern yoga, and therefore they try to sort of rescue the text, make it more applicable to those who are actually reading it, and therefore the modern translations shy away from the truth of the original intent of the text and its who it was written for. So we have examples of scholar practitioners of Tantra even writing commentaries on the text. And I'm thinking here of Pandit Rajmani Tigunite, for example, has written some very good commentaries on the Yoga-sutra, which are essentially attempting to rescue the text for tantric practitioners, reinterpreting it, in a different context, that of a tantric sadhana. And this is perfectly valid. Of course, you can reinterpret it. I'm not saying that people shouldn't do that, not in any way. But what I am saying is there are texts that don't need so much reinterpretation to be applicable to modern yoga practitioners. So if all things were equal and there were no other factors to consider, and somebody asked me what would be the number one text you would recommend for centering in yoga teacher trainings, for making the basis of yoga teacher trainings, certainly one of the top contenders would be the Vātūlanātha-sūtras, which is a text, despite its brilliance, it's not well known in the world yet. I hope to make it more well known. And the Vātūlanātha-sūtras is much easier to study than the Yoga-sutras. It's only 13 sutras plus commentary. And the commentary is very important because we can't understand the sutras without it, at least not very well. Now, it's more appropriate for modern yoga practitioners to base their practice on than Patanjali's Yoga-sutra, because it's a text that embraces embodiment. It embraces life, living in the world. It doesn't seek a transcendent experience that removes us from the world. In fact, it seeks to facilitate an experience of divine consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, in everyday life while immersed in the world. And it sees that as a higher attainment, actually, than these transcendent states that remove you from the world. So the goal, we could say, is really opposite in a way to Patanjali's originally conceived goal. Now, not entirely opposite, of course, because both involve a radical shift in one's experience of reality. But there's a big difference between a radical shift that removes you from life and the world, and one that facilitates the experience of divine consciousness while immersed in the world. Okay, so having said this, I want to take a minute to show you how the Vātūlanātha-sūtras, named after the great tantric master Vatulanatha, in a way refute Patanjali's view. In fact, it's possible that a couple of the sutras were specifically aimed at Patanjali's view and seeking to sink his battleship, as it were, to use a random metaphor. So let's see how this is the case. As you know, in Patanjali's Yoga-sutra, sutra number 2 is yoga-chitta-vritti-nirodha. Yoga is the state in which the fluctuations of the mind have become still. So yoga is a state of cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. So the vrittis of the chitta have become absent or still. So these vrittis, these fluctuations or activities of the mind, are seen as precisely the problem in Patanjali. And he says that when this goal, or when the state is attained of a total stillness of the mental faculty, the mental emotional faculty, to be more accurate, then you naturally rest in your true nature. You come to rest in what you fundamentally are. You abide in what you are. That's Patanjali's argument in a nutshell there in sutras number 2 and 3 of his text. Now, in the first sutra of the Vātūlanātha-sūtras, we see something very different. It says mahā-sāhasa-vṛttyā svarūpa-lābhaḥ, which means through the activity of the great spontaneous immediacy, one stabilizes in one's true nature. So the same goal here, stabilizing in your true nature, but instead of a cessation of vrittis, it's actually through a particular kind of vritti, through a particular kind of activity. Here, the vritti in question is not a thought or emotion, which is what Patanjali has in mind when he uses the word vritti. But the vritti in question is the activity of the mahā-sāhasa, the great spontaneous immediacy. And this is very difficult to explain in words because it transcends the mind. But essentially, this great spontaneous immediacy has to do with living in maximum authenticity, living unfiltered in the sense of allowing spontaneous expression to arise from the depths of your being. Now, this is a subtle teaching because it's not talking about acting impulsively on the basis of your programming or conditioning, right? So if you just do whatever you feel like without giving any thought or consideration to it, then you would not be doing this practice. That's not what's intended here, because the great spontaneous immediacy is that activity that arises from essence nature, from the depths of what you are, from a place much deeper than the mind. So in order to cultivate this, you of course need meditation or some form of practice where you learn how to access your deepest nature. It might not be sitting still meditation, it might be moving meditation, or dancing or many other forms of practice that for a given individual might help them access the foundation of their being, their deepest non-mental, non-emotional, non-personality-based sense of beingness itself. Okay. So when activity spontaneously arises from that level of our being, it's called in this scripture, the Great Spontaneous Immediacy. And so it's actually through activity that one stabilizes in one's true nature, through the activity or cultivating that activity that arises from the depths spontaneously. But you see how it's an opposite. It's an opposite teaching in this way, not in every way, but in this way, because Patanjali says it's through cessation of activity that you will come to rest in your true nature. Okay, and then in the second sutra, we get, you know, a further extension of this teaching. It says, the flow of the activities of consciousness becomes all of a sudden saturated with the attainment of that, meaning the attainment of one's true nature, the realization of one's true nature. And here we see in the Sanskrit the word pravritti, which is an antonym of the word nivritti. Nivritti means cessation or coming to rest, and it's a word much favored by Patanjali, right? Who's often characterizes the goal of the practice as nivritti, cessation. And here it's pravritti, the opposite. It's a flowing. It's something that keeps flowing, pravritti. So the flow of the activities of consciousness, the vṛtti-pravṛttiḥ, becomes all of a sudden saturated with the attainment of one's true nature. In other words, it's saying, hey, activity is not a problem when it is saturated with this realization. You know, so in other words, engaging in the world doesn't take you away from your essence nature when this engagement, this flow of activities, is saturated with the realization of one's true nature. So this is, again, countering Patanjali and countering all those people who seem to think that being in the world, you know, participating in society, culture, politics, and so on, is in some way antithetical to or takes you away from your true nature. And of course, there are ways in which any of those things can constitute a distraction from your spiritual life, but they need not take you away from your true nature. Now, having said all this, this scripture I'm talking about, the Vātūlanātha-sūtras, does carve out a place for the experience of the waveless state, that is to say, the state of absolute stillness, that is much favored by Patanjali. So that's not rejected here. For example, in Sutra 11 of this text, we see the statement, when the 5 observances arise, there is immersion into the waveless. Okay, and so the waveless is identical to the state that for Patanjali is chitta-vritti nirodha, that is a state of total stillness, internal silence, absolutely nothing happening, just pure silent stillness or still silent presence. So that's also given a place in this text, not rejected. It's just part of a bigger picture. It's not fetishized. It's important, but also learning how to flow in activity, in engaged activity in the world, while being immersed in your true nature is at least as important for this tantric scripture. Now you'll notice there in Sutra 11, it said, when the 5 observances arise, there is immersion into the waveless. What are the 5 observances? Well, glad you asked, because this beautiful text, the Vātūlanātha-sūtras, is the topic of the online retreat I'm offering later this month. It's actually an in-person retreat that you can also access online and view, or you can simply watch the recordings after the fact, but you would have to sign up before the retreat begins. So this begins on August 25th, and I'm really excited because it's a immersive 6-day retreat in which, for the first time, we explore the teachings of the Vātūlanātha-sūtras, which, like I said, is really a contender for the best choice, in my view, for a text to base a yoga teacher training on in place of the Yoga-sutras of Patanjali. And I think if people read the pair of texts sort of objectively, independent of the fact that they received teachings on the Yoga Sutra from their beloved teachers or gurus or whatever, independent of these biases, anyone who read these two, I think, would agree that it makes far more sense to privilege this tantric masterpiece that embraces embodiment over a pre-tantric text that seeks to transcend embodiment. That when the context is precisely people seeking to deepen their experience of embodiment, it's really kind of crazy to center a text that teaches the opposite. So anyway, once I get this published and out there in the world, maybe my view will be less of a minority. We'll see. So if you're interested in participating in this retreat, or at least getting access to the recordings to view later, then please click the link in the comments and you'll get the details there. The Vātūlanātha-sūtras retreat. Really, it's the most amazing text. I can't over recommend it. I hope to see you there.